If you're a fearful avoidant attachment style, chances are you probably struggle with a lot of chronic guilt and shame. And this comes a lot more from your conditioning than you might realize. So in today's video, we're going to break down why you struggle with chronic guilt and shame. We're going to break these things into two different parts or camps: the guilt camp and the shame camp, because they are slightly different. And then we're going to talk about what you can actually do to heal this. Because chances are, if you don't get out of these chronic guilt and shame spirals, these are the places from which you betray yourself the most because you feel guilty, or you shut down the most and cause the most sabotage or harm to your relationships because you're carrying a lot of shame. And a lot of times these emotions, although you may be so accustomed to them as a fearful avoidant, and they might be almost a part of your nervous system and wiring on a regular basis at this point, these are the very things that if we don't heal them, they will cause devastation to our lives. And before we dive into this, I would love to hear from you. What does chronic guilt and shame cost you in your life, and how has it been affecting you? Let me know in the comments down below. Let's break this down into really simple terms. And I'm going to give you a powerful exercise that can help transform this in your life on a daily basis. First things first, at a high level, the differentiation between shame and guilt. Shame is I am bad. At my core, I am inherently flawed, bad, wrong, dysfunctional, defective. Shame is really like the I am, like your character. Shame, when we feel it, stings. It makes us feel a combination of embarrassment and sometimes anger or sadness. And it is basically the emotion that makes you most often want to retreat or hide. If you ever had the experience of like being embarrassed in front of a group of people, maybe you fell or something silly happened in front of a group of people, and sometimes you want to just like run away. That's often shame, okay? Or embarrassment, sort of a lighter version of shame. Guilt, on the other hand, is like, I did bad, okay? My mistake hurt somebody else. And a lot of times when you feel guilt, it's not about you at your core, it's about something you did, but it still feels highly uncomfortable. And a lot of times when we're in that particular position of discomfort with guilt, it feels like a hollowness in your torso or sort of slight ache in your heart. But a lot of times when people are carrying chronic guilt and shame, like I said earlier, they are some of the emotions that make us do the most dysfunctional things in our lives. And so I want to unpack first where this came from, what you can do, and I'll give you a really powerful exercise like I mentioned. So guilt and shame. Why, as a fearful avoidant, would you struggle with chronic guilt and shame? Well, because you probably grew up in an environment that either directly or indirectly guilted or shamed you frequently, and thus it made it a part of your conditioning. Our conditioning is essentially our programming at the subconscious level. It's how we have been taught across time to view ourselves and the world until it essentially got habituated into our subconscious. It became a part of our internal programming. I want you to first start by just asking yourself, was I guilted frequently as a child? Directly will be somebody actually said like, oh my gosh, how could you do this to me? And constantly made you feel responsible for their feelings and emotions, blamed you for things in ways that made you feel guilty, or even just directly guilt tripped you as a form of manipulation or to gain control. And if you look at that direct guilt, that's very painful. That can come from having a parent who's in active addiction, parents who are really struggling with their own ability to emotionally regulate. It can also come from parents who have narcissistic personality disorder or other mental health issues where they don't realize the impact of making a child solely responsible for their emotions, even if just for that snapshot in time that they're guilting. Indirect guilt, on the other hand, would come more often from seeing somebody in some particular way of being, especially somebody that you depend on or you're close to, but feeling like they're going through pain and you can't do much about it. Okay, it's a really fundamental part of where somebody's conditioning around guilt can come from. For example, if you were raised by a single mother who was constantly also going through bouts or periods of depression or depressive episodes, and just you could tell as a young child was hurting and in pain, and then you felt like they had to work because they had to be responsible for you, and maybe they give you some indirect messaging about that, you'll often take that on like, oh my gosh, this is my fault. It's of my doing that they're struggling and suffering and they don't get reprieve. And so guilt can also come through really taking on and essentially enmeshing with somebody else's state of being, decisions, or actions. In both cases, chronic guilt is usually something that when you feel it, two really important things happen. One, you lose your personal frame of reference. You get so busy worrying about somebody else's life and experience that you forget to honor your own. And two, that then leads to self-abandonment. And this is usually a really surprising conversation for people because when you are guilting yourself, a lot of times you are in a position, and we're going to get to a story about this in just a second, you're in a position where you're forgetting about how you feel in a situation. situation, right? If you're that child who grew up with a single parent, you're forgetting that, hey, also maybe my parent's not attuning to my needs. It doesn't mean that the single parent is wrong or bad for going through depressive episodes and still trying their best to show up. But you get so wrapped up in taking that on personally that you forget that, hey, I actually have feelings in the situation too. I wish that maybe I had a parent who could be more attentive. And so you disown your own needs as an adaptation to deal with that situation. But as an adult, that kind of dynamic will teach you to more chronically disown your own needs. And again, I want to be super clear. Like, if that was your single parent, they were probably doing the best they could what was going on at the time. But you'll just see that the intensity of what somebody else is going through has the potential to kind of bulldoze your own frame of reference and you staying in your experience. And then as an adult, when you carry that conditioning out to the world, it can cause you to constantly abandon yourself because you feel so badly about what somebody else is going through or experiencing that you forget that, hey, I am still a human being with my own feelings, my own needs, and my own frame of reference. I have to have boundaries sometimes. We're going to come back to that in a second. I just want to tell you very quickly about shame. Shame is a public emotion, okay? It's that emotion, like we said, that makes you want to hide. It's more about you at your core and your character. And a lot of things that cause shame or constitute for shame as an adult stem from things that happened in childhood. So a lot of times if you had a painful experience that you felt like you were the wrong one, or you were in a situation where you're taking on too much fault and you made it mean that fundamentally at your core you were bad or wrong, that can be a big part of the conditioning. If you have a parent who constantly says, bad, that's bad, and constantly gives you that messaging, you're like, oh, I'm bad. And truly, through repetition and emotion, because that's what fires and wires neural pathways, you can take that on and internalize that. But shame can also come through being shamed a lot growing up, being humiliated or manipulated in ways that are very unhealthy or sometimes abusive growing up in any kind of mentally, emotionally, physically really unsafe or unhealthy household. So I want to look at these two things and we're going to pair them together a little bit because they do tend to go hand in hand. First step, okay, of looking at this is I want you to ask yourself, like, how much am I chronically guilting or shaming myself? And one thing I used to get clients to do in regards to this, if this was a big challenge, is make a guilt or shame journal. So actually sit down and make a guilt or shame journal to truly see how frequent this experience is for you. On top of that, and I think this is a place where it's really important to pay attention to some of these things. On top of that, we tend to get this conditioned idea. And watch this, because as soon as I say this, you're going to feel resistance, but let me come full circle on it, okay? One of the things that often happens for people is we've come to believe that if I guilt and shame myself, then I will not make mistakes as often going forward. So you almost think you have to guilt and shame yourself into being better. That is a byproduct of classical conditioning. That is a byproduct of you being guilted or shamed when you did things wrong. Sometimes it was like silly mistakes, like you spilled a glass of water and you got guilted or shamed, right? Like human errors. And you always saw that, okay, when I make a mistake, I get guilted and shamed. And then that becomes a program. Then you reenact that program in relationship to self. You think, okay, if I do something wrong, I should guilt or shame myself. That is actually not the most functional approach. In fact, guilting and shaming yourself chronically has far more costs than it does benefits. And I'm going to tell you a story here to really illustrate this, because this is really important to get as a fearful avoidant in your healing journey. So I remember I had a client one time and he was a very kind man. He was a realtor. He had a good heart. He really took a lot on and he was a fearful avoidant. And he was really there for a lot of people in his life, really making these huge efforts for everybody. And I remember he told me a story. We had been working together for like 2 or 3 weeks. I was still kind of getting to know him. And he came in one day to a session and he said, oh my gosh, Thais, I'm so ashamed of myself. I feel terrible. I did the worst thing at the end of last week. And I said, oh, what happened? And he said he was going to the bank to deposit a check and he had another showing to get to and his boss was waiting for him. And he felt really under the gun, like really pressured. And he said he was waiting in line for the bank teller and that every time he would wait in line for the bank teller, he would often get this one woman. And he said this woman would always make a mistake. I'd always be like in some kind of rush and I'm there and I get her and she makes a mistake and has to redo all of my deposit information. And it would be frustrating. And today I was like, please, not today. Like my boss is waiting at the showing. I'm under pressure. I'm already behind. It was this big showing for his career. And he said that he waited in line. And sure enough, he's getting closer and closer and waiting in line. And sure enough, he lands at her. And he said, sure enough, the time went on. She went to deposit something and she made a mistake and they had to restart the whole process. And he said in that moment, as remember, like this generally good-hearted person, I said, hey, you should think about getting a new job because every time I come to see you, you always mess everything up. And he said that then he got the stuff done, walked out of there. He was angry. And then after a minute, he just felt terribly guilty. And he was shaming and shaming and shaming himself for days after until our session the following week. And I said, well, did you go and apologize? It was one of the first questions. Did you go and take accountability? Did you go apologize? He said, I'm never going back into the bank again. I'm too ashamed. And this is the moment that I want you to reflect and notice when you shame yourself. Usually what happens is you get so into the story of how you're bad, you did bad, and you beat yourself up and you're like, me, me, me. You just hurt somebody else. But then you're like you're just captured by the story of me, 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 all the things that I am. I'm so shameful. And to be perfectly honest, there's a little bit of like narcissism there, right? And not in that client and not in like anybody who's ever done this, but just notice it, right? It's just a trait, not narcissistic personality disorder, that when you make a mistake and hurt somebody else and then you go really into your head and ruminate about yourself, well, you're missing that empathy piece. You're missing that ability to step outside of yourself and recognize the cost of your actions. And this story for him is not unique. This is everybody's story when they chronically guilt and shame themselves. They get so engulfed in that story, that narrative of how they're shameful. And shame, like I said at the beginning of this video, is the emotion that makes you want to retreat and hide. When you're dealing with chronic shame, you usually do not confront or address issues. And so, I spoke with him and we did something different. Okay. And this is the exercise I want to propose to you. We did an exercise called I.C.A, just an abbreviation. It stands for Inquiry, Compassion, Accountability. And this is a great replacement for chronic guilt and shaming. Inquiry means, can I inquire about the root cause? And so I did this with him. I said, okay, so let's just backtrack. Let's step outside of the shaming of yourself and let's just look at root cause. What was happening that day and what were the events that led up to this? Okay, so let's get curious instead of judging and critical of ourselves. And what we discovered is that the root cause of why he behaved that way to the bank teller was that, and remember, this isn't an excuse, this is an exploration, right? We get to the accountability piece in a moment. But he said the root cause, what we discovered is that he was terrible at boundaries. And I came to find out that when he would try to set boundaries as a child, he was often physically punished in harsh ways. So he didn't know how to have boundaries. And then he always felt this deep need to win his father's approval as a young boy. And so he would do all of these things to overextend himself and then be boundaryless. And it was causing such an intense amount of disruption in his life that as this, generally quite good-hearted person who meant really well and tried to do the right thing, he would have these moments of kind of exploding, and not like with anger, but with saying things that were just harsh and too much and not appropriate, not healthy, right? To the bank teller. It's like it's not a kind thing to say. And so he found that the actual root cause was that he had huge boundary issues and then he would take on too much. And now that we had inquiry and I asked him about the times, okay, well then, as a child, what did that feel like to be scared of setting boundaries? And he detailed it out, shared with me some of the punishments he had, as a child. He was able to then have some compassion, which is C of that exercise, the letter C. He was able to then have some compassion for himself about that dynamic, right? Here I inquire, I realize root cause. Wow, I can actually see how in that moment that I'm waiting in the bank teller, there's all of this pent up for decades, years of frustration, fear, confusion, stress about just taking so much on and feeling so unsupported. And then, of course, that's going to come out in a different way. Of course, that's going to come out somewhere unhealthily in some form. And then because he had had the capacity to be compassionate to himself and get out of that shaming cycle, he then had room. And so much of accountability, we're not good at being accountable when we're self-shaming. We're better at being accountable when we have room to first go inward, get curious, identify the root cause, have some compassion for ourselves for that root cause, and then we can extend that compassion back out to somebody that we affected. And so that's what he did. He had the room after that to actually regulate and to go in and apologize to that bank teller and have an honest conversation, which went very well for him. And so I.C.A. in inquiry, compassion, accountability is a much better substitute than this idea that we just shame ourselves into being better. Because if you take an honest look at your life, when you try to do that, it doesn't work. And I want to let you know, if you want to go a little bit deeper into this whole topic overall, we actually have a whole chronic guilt and shame course. It comes with a guilt and shame journal section in the workbook that you can actually journal out how often you guilt and shame yourself, in what areas of life in your career or around relationships, and then actually start to rewire at a deeper level, leveraging neuroscience and our understanding of the nervous system, how to actually create transformation here at the same time. So if you want to go into that, you can actually win that fully for free as a course you get to keep for life, or as part of a 7-day trial, 14-day free trial, or even a month-long membership for free to PDS. We're doing a spin to win promotion if you want to check that out down below right now. It's just there for a limited time, but my hope for you is that you're able to dive into some of these things and really start healing, because chronic guilt and shame will never serve. And they're not doing anything for you the way that you might think. You've just been conditioned to think that that's the way forward. And I promise you, as somebody who very much chronically guilted and shamed myself for a very long time, the more work I did on that, the more room I had to just own my mistakes. I'm a human being. I'm going to make mistakes sometimes, as are all of us. And when you have the room to do that, you have so much more room to just acknowledge your mistakes and bounce back faster and grow from them and get beyond them and keep learning and evolving as a person, and be able to sort out any problems that a mistake caused in your life, in a friendship or a relationship, through that ability to take radical ownership and be honest about what root causes. And the last thing I just want to say here is, if we don't get curious about the root cause, we can't course correct for the root cause, which means we're just more likely to keep repeating that same old pattern over and over again. So this is a really powerful exercise if you're willing to do the work. I hope this is helpful for you. And thank you so much for stopping by and for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video today. And don't forget, there's that spin to win promotion down below, and I'll see you next time.